"She's moving into the East Wing, Lisa," David said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing a change in the weather. "The stress of the city isn't good for the baby." Lisa stopped rearranging the calla lilies in the Waterford vase. The stem she was holding snapped, a sharp crack echoing in the cavernous foyer of the estate. She didn't look at the young woman standing hesitantly by the doorway, clutching a designer overnight bag like a shield. She looked at her husband of 10 years. "You brought her here?" Lisa's voice was a whisper, stripped of all emotion. "To my home?" "It's our home, Lisa," David corrected gently, adjusting his cuffs. "And she needs peace." Lisa set the broken flower down. Not anymore. The silence following Lisa's words wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was a physical weight pressing down on the three of them. The grand foyer of Highfield Manor, with its sweeping mahogany staircase and intricate plasterwork ceiling, suddenly felt suffocatingly small. David sighed, a sound of practiced exhaustion. He was a man who wore his wealth comfortably, from the precise cut of his Italian suit to the effortless way he commanded a room. But right now, his handsome face was etched with irritation. "Lisa, please don't be dramatic. It's unseemly." He gestured toward the young woman, who had shrunk back slightly. "This is Chloe. She's 22. She's terrified, and she's carrying my child. You, of all people, should understand the importance of family." The barb was sharp, aimed precisely at the quiet, enduring ache of their 10 years together. 10 years of doctors, specialists, and silent, empty nurseries. Lisa felt the sting, but her face remained an unreadable mask. She was the Duchess, a nickname earned not through lineage, but through her impeccable poise, her formidable intellect, and the iron grip with which she managed David's chaotic life and sprawling business interests. "Family," Lisa repeated, the word tasting of ash. She finally turned her gaze to Chloe. The girl was undeniably beautiful, with wide, frightened eyes and a nervous habit of chewing her lower lip. Her slight frame barely betrayed the pregnancy, but the way she protectively rested a hand on her stomach was a glaring confirmation. "I am sorry," Chloe whispered, her voice barely carrying over the ticking of the grandfather clock. "I didn't want to cause trouble." "Then you shouldn't have come," Lisa said smoothly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The chill in her tone was enough to make the younger woman flinch. "Lisa, that's enough," David snapped, stepping between them. "Chloe is staying. The East Wing has been prepared. You don't have to interact with her if you don't want to. I've hired a private nurse and staff specifically for her needs." He was managing the situation, Lisa realized with a cold clarity, just as he managed a difficult acquisition or a restless board of directors. He had compartmentalized his life, and she, his wife, had simply been moved to a different folder. "You've prepared the East Wing," Lisa echoed, her mind racing, connecting dots she had previously ignored. The strange charges on the platinum account, the sudden increase in security personnel, the interior designer he claimed was updating the guest suites. He had been planning this. This wasn't a panicked decision. It was a carefully executed maneuver. "I thought it best," David said smoothly, regaining his composure. "It allows everyone their space. You can continue with your charities, your events. Nothing has to change publicly." Nothing has to change publicly. That was David's cardinal rule. The facade must be maintained at all costs. Lisa turned away from them, walking slowly toward the large, arched window that overlooked the manicured gardens. The sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows across the lawns she had painstakingly restored over the past decade. This house, This life had been her project. She had built the foundation upon which David stood. "David," she said, her back still turned, "do you truly believe you can bring your pregnant mistress into my home, set her up in the East Wing, and expect me to simply play hostess at your next gala?" "It's complicated, Lisa." He deflected, the edge returning to his voice. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Lisa closed her eyes. The scent of the calla lilies, usually a comfort, now smelled sickly sweet, like decay. She had spent 10 years being understanding. 10 years of looking the other way at his flirtations, his late nights, his business trips. She had convinced herself it was the price of admission to the life they had built together. But this was an eviction notice, delivered with terrifying politeness. She opened her eyes and turned back to face him. Her posture was perfectly straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "You're right, David," she said, her voice entirely devoid of the anger he was bracing for. "It is complicated." She walked past him, giving Chloe a wide berth, and headed toward the stairs. "Where are you going?" David demanded, confusion momentarily replacing his irritation. "To pack an overnight bag." Lisa replied without breaking her stride. "I find the air in here suddenly stifling." She didn't look back as she ascended the stairs. She didn't need to see the relief on David's face or the confusion on Chloe's. Let them have the foyer. Let them have the East Wing. By morning, Lisa resolved as she entered her suite and quietly locked the door. They would have a very different problem on their hands. The master suite, occupying the entire South Wing, was a sanctuary of muted tones and understated luxury. Lisa ignored the sprawling king-sized bed and moved directly to her private study, a room David rarely entered. She didn't pack an overnight bag. Instead, she sat at her antique mahogany desk, booted up her encrypted laptop, and unlocked the heavy-bottom drawer. Inside lay a thick, leather-bound folio. This was her insurance policy, years ago. When David's first startup was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, it was Lisa who had secured the bridge loan from her formidable father, a man who viewed David with undisguised contempt. In exchange, Lisa had drafted a series of complex legal agreements, structuring them with a labyrinthine brilliance that David, always focused on the grand vision and never the fine print, had signed without a second glance. Over the years, as the business expanded into a multi-million-dollar empire, Lisa had quietly maintained control of the architecture beneath it. She was the silent partner, the unseen architect. The public saw David, the charismatic CEO. The board saw David, but the holding companies, the shell corporations, the offshore accounts, those were registered under entities Lisa controlled. She opened the folio and began reviewing the documents. Her father had always warned her. A man who builds his house on another's land owns neither the house nor the land. David thought he owned Highfield Manor. He didn't. He thought he owned the majority shares in his primary tech firm. He didn't. Lisa began making calls. The first was to her lead attorney, a ruthless litigator named Marcus Thorne, who operated out of a nondescript office in Geneva. "Marcus," she said when he answered, ignoring pleasantries. "It's time to initiate Protocol Delta." A low chuckle came through the line. "I was beginning to think you'd never pull the trigger, Lisa. Are you certain? This will leave a crater." "He brought her home, Marcus. She's pregnant and she's in the East Wing." The line went silent for a beat. Then Marcus's voice returned, stripped of its previous amusement. "I understand. The transfer of the primary assets will be complete by 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The secondary holdings will follow within 48 hours. What about the immediate liquid capital? Ocker, freeze the joint accounts, Lisa instructed, her fingers flying across her keyboard, authorizing the digital transfers Marcus required. Leave him access to the corporate expense account for now. Let him think it's a banking error. And the manor? The deed is held by the Vanguard Trust, Lisa replied, glancing at a document detailing the estate's ownership. Notify the property management firm. Eviction proceedings can begin immediately, but stall them. I want him to feel secure before the ground gives way. Consider it done. Where will you be? I'm staying, Lisa said softly. I wouldn't miss this for the world. She disconnected the call and leaned back in her chair, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. She was not the weeping, discarded wife. She was the Duchess, and her husband had just committed treason within her walls, downstairs. She could hear the faint murmur of voices. David likely reassuring his young mistress, directing the staff, acting the part of the benevolent patriarch. He was so confident in his reality, so utterly oblivious to the fact that the floorboards beneath him had already been removed. Lisa spent the next few hours meticulously severing the financial arteries that kept David's lifestyle afloat. She canceled the black cards, rerouted the dividends, and triggered clauses in their prenuptial agreement that he had long forgotten existed. By midnight, David was a man standing in a palace he no longer owned, spending money he no longer had. When she finally emerged from her study, the house was silent. She walked to the large window at the end of the hallway, looking out at the darkened grounds. The security lights cast long, stark beams across the driveway. Tomorrow, David would wake up expecting an argument. He would expect tears, perhaps a demand for a divorce, maybe a negotiation regarding a settlement. He would be prepared for an emotional battle. He was not prepared for a war of attrition. Lisa smiled, a small, tight expression that didn't reach her eyes. She turned and walked back to her room, leaving the hallway shrouded in shadows. Let him sleep peacefully tonight. It would be his last night of comfort for a very long time. Morning broke over Highfield Manor with a deceptive brightness. David sat at the head of the long dining table, a newspaper snapped open before him, a cup of perfectly brewed espresso cooling at his side. He wore an expression of mild annoyance, having expected Lisa to appear and cause a scene before his departure for the office. Instead, the only sound was the clinking of silverware against porcelain, as Chloe tentatively picked at a fruit salad at the far end of the table. She looked pale, the morning light emphasizing the dark circles under her eyes. The grand dining room, designed to seat 20, made her look small and entirely out of place. "Did you sleep well, Chloe?" David asked, not looking up from the financial section. "Yes, thank you," she lied softly. She had spent the night jumping at every creak of the old house, terrified that the formidable woman she had met yesterday would burst through the door. "Good. I've arranged for the chef to prepare a specific dietary menu for you. High protein, folic acid, all that nonsense," he said dismissively. "Just tell Mrs. Hughes what you need." Before Chloe could formulate a response, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Lisa entered, dressed immaculately in a tailored charcoal suit, her hair pulled back into a severe chignon. She looked neither distressed nor angry. She looked like a CEO stepping into a hostile boardroom. David lowered his paper, bracing himself. "Lisa, good morning, David," she replied evenly, taking a seat midway down the table, effectively ignoring the head and the foot. She poured herself a cup of tea, the movements deliberate and unhurried. "I was beginning to think you were avoiding us," David said, a hint of his usual condescension creeping back into his tone. He found her calmness unsettling. He preferred her sharp tongue. He knew how to manage that. Silence was harder to counter. Hardly, Lisa said, taking a sip. I simply had a busy morning. International markets wait for no one. David frowned. Lisa rarely discussed her investments at breakfast. It was an unspoken rule. Mornings were for his business, evenings for social pleasantries. Well, David said, eager to move past the awkwardness. I'm glad to see you're being reasonable. I have a board meeting at 10 regarding the merger. I won't be home until late. He stood up, tossing his napkin onto the table. Chloe, Mrs. Hughes will see to you. Lisa, I assume you have things under control here. I do, Lisa said softly, not looking at him. David hesitated for a fraction of a second, unsettled by the lack of conflict, before turning and striding toward the door. He didn't make it out of the house. He was in the foyer, shrugging into his coat held by the butler, when his phone buzzed. It was a text from his CFO. Urgent. Corporate accounts locked. Credit lines suspended. Call me ASAP. David stared at the screen, annoyance flaring. A glitch. It had to be a glitch. He dialed the CFO's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Damn it, Richard, answer the phone, he muttered, typing out a quick response before stepping out the front door toward his waiting driver. As he settled into the back seat of the town car, his personal phone rang. It was his private banker. David. The banker's voice was tense, devoid of its usual sycophantic warmth. We have a significant problem. I'm aware, Charles. My CFO just texted me. The corporate accounts are locked. Get IT on it immediately. I have a merger to finalize. It's not IT, David, Charles said carefully. The accounts weren't locked due to a technical error. They were frozen. And it's not just the corporate accounts, your personal accounts, the joint accounts, everything. David went still, the leather seat suddenly feeling very cold. Frozen? By whom? By the primary signatory, David. Lisa. The silence stretched in the car, thick and suffocating. David looked back at the imposing facade of Highfield Manor. Through the large window of the dining room, he could just make out Lisa's silhouette, still seated at the table, calmly sipping her tea. That's impossible, David choked out, panic finally clawing at his throat. I'm the primary earner. Those are my accounts. I'm afraid that's not what the documentation states, Charles replied, his tone apologetic but firm. The holding companies, the trusts, they are all legally structured under entities controlled entirely by your wife. You are listed as a secondary beneficiary, subject to her authorization. Fix it, Charles, David demanded, his voice rising. I don't care what the paperwork says. Fix it. I can't, David. The mandates are ironclad. I'm sorry, but until Lisa authorizes the release, you have zero liquidity. David ended the call, his hand shaking slightly. He looked again at the house. The grand manor, the manicured lawns, the life he had built. It was suddenly a mirage. He hadn't built it. She had, and she had just dismantled it in a single night. He instructed the driver to take him back to the front door. The board meeting would have to wait. He needed to have a very different conversation with his wife. The war he had anticipated hadn't just started. He realized with a sickening dread that he might have already lost. David stormed back into the foyer, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him with a finality that made the crystal chandelier tremble. The illusion of control, the carefully constructed persona of the untouchable CEO, was fracturing rapidly. He found Lisa exactly where he had left her, calmly finishing her tea in the cavernous dining room. Chloe was gone, likely having fled back to the East Wing at the first sign of his return. What have you done? David demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble as he approached the table. He didn't sit. He loomed over her, a physical manifestation of the panic tightening his chest. Lisa dabbed her lips with a linen napkin, deliberately slow. "I'm not sure I understand the question, David. I've simply been managing the household affairs, as I always do." "Don't play games with me, Lisa," he snapped, slamming a hand down on the polished mahogany. The espresso cup rattled violently in its saucer. "Charles just called. The accounts, all of them, they're frozen." "Ah, yes," Lisa murmured, finally looking up at him. Her eyes were devoid of the anger he expected. They were entirely unreadable, cold as the marble beneath their feet. "I authorized a temporary hold, a precautionary measure. Given the sudden expansion of our household, I felt a review of our financial structure was necessary." "A temporary hold?" David laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You've cut off my access to my own money, to the corporate accounts. Do you have any idea what you're doing? The merger is today, Lisa. If I walk into that boardroom without liquidity, the deal collapses." "Then perhaps you should postpone the meeting," Lisa suggested mildly. "Or perhaps you should have considered the financial implications before moving your pregnant mistress into the East Wing." The blunt reality of her words struck him. He had anticipated her anger, her tears, even a demand for a divorce. He had not anticipated a calculated, surgical strike at the foundation of his power. "You think this is a negotiation?" David hissed, leaning closer. "You think you can hold my money hostage until I send Chloe away? It's too late for that, Lisa. She's staying. I haven't asked you to send her away." Lisa countered, her voice remaining impossibly steady. "In fact, I encourage her to stay. Highfield Manor is quite comfortable. The East Wing is lovely this time of year." David stared at her, confusion warring with his rising anger. "Then what is this? Why freeze the accounts?" "Because, David," Lisa said, standing up. She wasn't a tall woman, but in that moment, she seemed to command the entire room. "For 10 years, I have managed the invisible architecture of your life. I structured the loans, I created the holding companies, I insulated you from the consequences of your own arrogance. You built the facade, but I poured the concrete." She walked toward the door, pausing only briefly. "You brought your mess into my home. You assumed I would simply adjust. But I am not an employee you can reassign, David. I own the concrete. And as of this morning, I am no longer willing to support the facade." "You're crazy," David said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You can't legally do this. I'll call Marcus. I'll have the lawyers tear those contracts apart." Lisa smiled, a fleeting expression that held no warmth. "Marcus is my attorney, David, not yours. And the contracts are ironclad. I made sure of it. You see, I always knew this day might come. I just didn't expect the catalyst to be quite so cliché." She left the dining room, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. David stood alone amidst the luxury, the silence of the house suddenly oppressive. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over his attorney's number. But a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. Lisa was not a woman prone to empty threats. If she said the contracts were ironclad, they were. He had intended to humiliate her privately, to manage the situation and maintain his pristine public image. Instead, he had walked blindly into a trap she had been meticulously setting for a decade. The Duchess hadn't just left him. She had locked the doors, turned off the lights, and taken the keys to the kingdom. While David scrambled to find a lawyer who would take his calls without a retainer, Chloe sat in the sitting room of the East Wing suite, clutching a silk throw pillow as if it were a life raft. The suite was breathtaking. Antique furniture, Persian rugs, a view of the rose gardens. But it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully appointed cage. She had heard the slammed doors downstairs. She had heard the raised voices, though the heavy walls muffled the words. The knot of anxiety in her stomach tightened, a sharp contrast to the gentle flutter of the life growing inside her. Chloe wasn't a gold digger, despite what David's wife, Lisa, surely thought. She was a junior copywriter at David's firm, swept up in a whirlwind romance by a charismatic, powerful man who had promised her the world. He had spun a tale of a loveless, arrangements-only marriage, painting Lisa as a cold, distant figure who cared only for social standing. When she discovered she was pregnant, panic had set in. But David had been resolute. He would take care of her. He would bring her home. He had made it sound so simple, so logical. Meeting Lisa had shattered that illusion. The woman was indeed cold, but not in the way David had described. Lisa's coldness was calculated, terrifyingly focused. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't cried. She had simply looked at Chloe with an indifference that was far more devastating than anger. A soft knock startled her. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Hughes, the formidable housekeeper, carrying a silver tray laden with a steaming bowl of oatmeal, fresh berries, and a small glass of orange juice. "Your breakfast, Miss Chloe," Mrs. Hughes said, her tone professional but completely devoid of warmth. She set the tray down on the coffee table. "Thank you," Chloe murmured, not meeting the woman's eye. She felt the silent judgment radiating from the housekeeper. "Mr. David has left for the office," Mrs. Hughes added, pausing by the door. "He said he would be late." Chloe nodded, a sinkhole opening in her chest. He had left her here, alone, in this massive, silent house, with the woman he had betrayed. Is Mrs. Lisa here?" Chloe asked hesitantly. Mrs. Hughes's expression tightened. "Madame is in her study. She is not to be disturbed. If you require anything, please use the call button. I or one of the staff will attend to you." The implication was clear. Chloe was a guest, an unwelcome one, to be managed by the staff, not acknowledged by the lady of the house. "Mrs. Hughes?" Chloe started, desperation edging into her voice. "I don't want to cause trouble. I didn't want this." The housekeeper stopped, turning slowly. For a moment, a flicker of something resembling pity crossed her stern features. "Trouble has already arrived, Miss Chloe. Wanting it or not changes nothing." She left, closing the door softly. Chloe stared at the breakfast tray. The thought of food made her nauseous. She stood up and paced the room, the walls feeling closer with every step. David had promised her safety, comfort, a family. But the reality was isolation, hostility, and a creeping sense of profound dread. She walked to the window, looking out over the expansive grounds. A sleek, black town car was pulling out of the driveway. David. He was leaving to fight whatever battles he faced, leaving her behind in the war zone he had created. For the first time since she realized she was pregnant, a cold, hard truth settled over Chloe. David hadn't brought her here to protect her. He had brought her here because it was convenient for him, a way to force his wife's hand without dirtying his own. He had used her as a pawn in a game she didn't even know they were playing. And as she looked at the meticulously manicured gardens, a chilling thought took root. The woman downstairs, the silent architect of this estate, wasn't the monster David had described. She was simply a woman who had finally decided to stop playing the game. And Chloe, the naive pregnant mistress, was caught squarely in the crossfire. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the glass and steel skyscraper was usually David's arena. It was where he dazzled, where he dominated, where he bent reality to his will. Today, it felt like an execution chamber. The executives from the acquiring firm sat across the polished table, their expressions expectant. His own team looked nervous. And David, for the first time in his professional life, was sweating. David, the lead negotiator, a man named Sterling, began, steepling his fingers. We're prepared to move forward with the final signatures. However, our due diligence team flagged a slight anomaly this morning regarding the primary holding company's liquidity. A temporary freeze? David forced a smile, the muscles in his jaw tight. A minor administrative error, Sterling. A miscommunication with the bank regarding the escrow accounts. It's being resolved as we speak. He lied smoothly, an old habit. But beneath the table, his hand gripped his phone. He had spent the last 2 hours leaving increasingly desperate voicemails for Charles, the private banker, and attempting to contact Marcus Thorne, only to be politely informed that Mr. Thorne was unavailable. An administrative error. Sterling repeated, his tone skeptical. David, this is a multi-million-dollar acquisition. We need assurances that the capital structure is solid. We cannot finalize this merger if the holding company's assets are inaccessible. I understand completely. David deflected, trying to steer the conversation back to the projections, the synergy, the vision. But the words felt hollow. The charisma that usually carried him through difficult meetings felt forced, brittle. His CFO, Richard, leaned in closely. David, he whispered, his face pale. I just heard back from legal. They pulled the filings on the holding company. Lisa is the sole managing director. She has unilateral authority over the assets. David's stomach plummeted. He had always known Lisa handled the intricate corporate structuring. He had encouraged it. It kept his hands clean of the boring details. He had simply signed where she told him to sign, trusting her implicitly. It was a fatal miscalculation. Sterling, David said, his voice rougher than he intended. I need a brief recess to clear up this administrative hurdle. Sterling checked his watch. We have flights to catch, David. We can give you 20 minutes. If the accounts aren't verified by then, we'll have to pause the proceedings indefinitely. David practically ran from the room, Richard hot on his heels. They sequestered themselves in David's corner office. What do you mean, unilateral authority? David demanded, pacing frantically. It's my company. My name is on the door. Your name is on the branding, Richard corrected, looking miserable. The actual corporate entity, the one that holds the patents, the cash reserves, the contracts. It's entirely controlled by Vanguard Trust, and Lisa is the sole trustee. She can't do this, David muttered, running a hand through his hair. The panic was no longer a cold knot. It was a fire spreading through his veins. She's sabotaging the merger. She's sabotaging everything I've built. She's not sabotaging it, David, Richard said quietly. She owns it. Legally, she can do whatever she wants with it. David stared at his CFO, the reality of the situation finally crashing over him. The board meeting, the merger, his carefully cultivated image, it was all a house of cards, and Lisa had just removed the bottom tier. He had brought his pregnant mistress into her home, assuming she would simply endure the humiliation, perhaps extract a hefty divorce settlement, but ultimately allow him to continue his life uninterrupted. He had underestimated her profoundly. He pulled out his phone and dialed Lisa's number. It went straight to voicemail. Lisa, he said, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance, replaced by a desperate edge. Please, call me back. We need to talk. You can't do this. The merger, everything is falling apart. please." He ended the call, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. He had spent his life building an empire, believing he was the king. He was just realizing that he had only ever been a tenant, and the landlord had just served him his eviction notice. The 20 minutes passed. The accounts remained frozen. The merger fell through. By the time David returned to Highfield Manor that evening, the news of the collapsed deal had already leaked to the financial press. He walked through the grand foyer, the silence of the house no longer oppressive, but terrifyingly final. He had lost his company, his leverage, and his pride in a single day. And the woman who had orchestrated it all was somewhere in this house, silently watching the fallout. The heavy oak door of Highfield Manor closed behind David with a definitive click, a sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the cavernous foyer. He stood motionless for a long moment, the evening shadows stretching across the marble floor like grasping fingers. His tie, usually a perfect Windsor knot, hung loose around his collar. The tailored Italian suit felt heavy, suffocating. Just 12 hours ago, he had walked out of this house as a king. He returned as a trespasser. He found Lisa in the library, the only room in the house where a fire crackled in the hearth. She was seated in a high-backed leather chair, a pristine porcelain teacup resting on the table beside her, an open book on her lap. She looked entirely at peace, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. "Lisa," he began, his voice hoarse. It cracked slightly, betraying the exhaustion and panic he was desperately trying to suppress. She turned a page, not looking up. "You're home early, David. I thought the merger celebration would keep you in the city until midnight." The mildness of her tone was a physical blow. He crossed the room, stopping just short of the firelight's reach. "There is no merger." Sterling walked away. "The accounts are locked, the credit lines are frozen, and Charles won't even take my calls. You orchestrated this." Lisa carefully placed a silk bookmark between the pages and closed the book. She finally looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "I simply secured my assets, David. The timing of your merger was entirely coincidental." "Your assets?" He let out a harsh, ragged laugh. "I built that company. I pitched the clients. I was the face on every magazine cover. You sat in the background. And in the background, I built the foundation." Lisa replied, her voice remaining perfectly modulated, devoid of the hysteria he so desperately wanted to provoke. "You were the salesman, David. A very good one. But you were selling a house built on land you didn't own. Vanguard Trust owns the holding company. I am the sole trustee of Vanguard. It is a simple matter of corporate law. You can't do this," he pleaded, the anger giving way to a sickening desperation. He sank into the armchair opposite her, burying his face in his hands. "You're ruining me, Lisa." "Over what? Pride? Because I brought Chloe here?" "Because you disrespected the sanctity of my home." She corrected him softly. "You assumed my silence was compliance. You thought you could parade your indiscretions through my halls, and I would simply adjust the menu to accommodate them. You underestimated my boundaries, and more importantly, you underestimated my intelligence." David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "I'll fight you. I'll hire the best litigators in the country. We've been married for 10 years. There are community property laws. Our prenuptial agreement, which you signed without reading because you were too eager for my father's bridge loan, explicitly waives your right to any assets held by Vanguard." Lisa stated, reciting the facts with lethal precision. "And as for hiring litigators, you might find that difficult. The joint accounts are frozen pending a forensic audit, a process that will take months. You currently have exactly what is in your wallet." Before David could formulate a response to this devastating reality, The heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the house. Lisa glanced at the antique grandfather clock. Right on time. "Who is that?" David asked, a new wave of dread washing over him. "That would be the property management representatives," Lisa said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "They are here to serve you with a 30-day notice to vacate Highfield Manor. Furthermore, the leasing company will be arriving at dawn to repossess the Bentley and the Range Rover. I suggest you pack a bag, David. I believe the East Wing is suddenly feeling very crowded." David stared at her, paralyzed. The Duchess hadn't just checkmated him. She had cleared the board entirely. He was drowning, and she was standing on the shore, calmly watching him go under. The silence of the East Wing was absolute, broken only by the frantic sound of Chloe pulling clothes from mahogany hangers and shoving them into her designer overnight bag. The beautiful gilded cage had lost its luster the moment she saw David return. She had watched from the top of the grand staircase as he confronted Lisa in the library. She hadn't heard all the words, but she had heard the tone. She had heard the desperation in David's voice, the shattered ego of a man who realized he had nothing. And she had seen Lisa unyielding, an iceberg that had just ripped the hull out of David's luxury liner. He didn't have the money. He didn't have the power. He didn't even own the house they were standing in. The fairy tale he had spun for her, the wealthy, trapped executive seeking refuge in her arms, was a spectacular lie. He wasn't a victim of a cold marriage. He was a parasite who had finally been detached from his host. The door to the suite swung open without a knock. David stood in the doorway, his hair disheveled, his eyes wild and unfocused. He looked 10 years older than the man who had confidently escorted her into the foyer the day before. He saw the open bag on the bed, and his expression darkened. "What are you doing?" "I'm leaving, David," Chloe said, her voice remarkably steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. She didn't stop packing. "You can't leave," he snapped, stepping into the room and closing the door heavily behind him. "Where are you going to go? You don't have an apartment. You quit your job." "Because you told me to," she countered, finally looking at him. The charisma that had once dazzled her now looked like a cheap parlor trick. "You promised you would take care of me. You promised we were starting a family in your home." "It's a temporary setback," David insisted, running a hand frantically through his hair. He paced the length of the Persian rug. "Lisa is throwing a tantrum. I just need a few days to get a lawyer, to untangle the assets. I'll get a hotel suite for us. I just need to use my personal credit lines." "She froze everything, David," Chloe said quietly. "I heard you downstairs. You have nothing." "I am David Caldwell," he shouted, the sudden volume making her flinch. The mask was entirely gone now, revealing the arrogant, terrified man beneath. "My name means something in this city. People owe me favors. You just need to be patient. You're carrying my child, for God's sake. You owe me some loyalty." Chloe zipped her bag closed with a sharp, decisive pull. "I owe you nothing. You didn't bring me here to build a family. You brought me here to punish your wife. You used me, David. And now that she's taken away your toys, you want me to sit in a hotel room and wait for you to figure out a new scam." She walked past him, grabbing her coat. He reached out, grabbing her arm tightly. "You walk out that door, Chloe, and you get nothing from me," he threatened, his voice a low hiss. "No child support, no settlement. I'll make sure you disappear." Chloe looked down at his hand, gripping her arm, then up into his desperate eyes. She felt a profound wave of pity, not for herself, but for him. "You don't have anything to give me anyway," she whispered, pulling her arm free. She left the suite, walking briskly down the long hallway. As she reached the top of the main staircase, she saw Lisa standing in the foyer, holding a manila folder. The older woman watched her descend, her expression unreadable. Chloe paused at the bottom step. "I'm leaving." "I see that," Lisa said softly. She held out the folder. "This is a severance package from the firm. 6 months of your previous salary, plus health insurance coverage for the duration of your pregnancy. It is strictly business, Chloe. You were an employee, and your departure was poorly managed by your superior." Chloe stared at the folder, tears finally prickling her eyes. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was grace. "Why?" "Because," Lisa said, her gaze drifting up toward the empty hallway of the East Wing. "Collateral damage should always be minimized when possible." Chloe took the folder, nodded once in silent gratitude, and walked out the heavy oak doors into the cool morning air, leaving David to face the ruins of his own making. 3 months later, the autumn wind whipped through the financial district, carrying the crisp scent of fallen leaves and the bitter sting of winter approaching. David sat in a cramped, windowless conference room in a mediocre midtown law firm, a space that smelled faintly of stale coffee and cheap carpet cleaner. He wore a suit that was a season out of date, the fabric slightly rumpled, hanging loosely on a frame that had lost 15 pounds. Across the chipped veneer table sat Marcus Thorne, Lisa's attorney, looking entirely too comfortable in a bespoke navy pinstripe. Beside Marcus sat Lisa. She was the picture of elegance in a cream cashmere turtleneck and a camel coat draped over her shoulders. She looked rested, vibrant, and utterly untouchable. "Let's review the final settlement parameters," Marcus began, his voice a smooth baritone that grated on David's frayed nerves. He slid a thick stack of documents across the table. David didn't look at the papers. He stared at Lisa. He had spent the last 90 days living in a rented studio apartment, watching his world burn to ash. Every favor he tried to call in evaporated the moment his contacts realized Vanguard Trust was no longer backing him. The luxury cars were gone. His country club membership was revoked for non-payment. "You took the company," David rasped, his voice rough. "Our Vanguard Trust maintained its ownership of the company." Marcus corrected gently. "My client simply removed you from your position as CEO due to a breach of fiduciary duty and erratic personal behavior that threatened the firm's public standing. The board, which she controls, voted unanimously." "And the debt?" David demanded, slamming a fist on the table. "You left me with all of it." Marcus adjusted his glasses. "The corporate debts remain with the corporation. However, the forensic audit revealed extensive personal borrowing on your part. You utilized personal margin loans against your perceived equity to fund a rather lavish lifestyle. Jewelry, private jet charters, extended hotel stays in the city. Because you possessed no actual equity in Vanguard, those margin calls defaulted to you personally. $2.4 million, David whispered, the number tasting like poison. "You expect me to pay $2.4 million in personal debt without an income?" "We expect nothing, David." Lisa spoke for the first time, her voice cool and clear. "The banks expect repayment. That is an issue between you and your creditors. It is no longer my concern." David leaned forward, his eyes pleading. The anger had burned itself out weeks ago, leaving only a hollow, echoing terror. "Lisa, 10 years. We built a life. You can't just walk away and leave me drowning. Give me a consulting role. Give me a percentage of the quarterly dividends. Something." Lisa looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw exactly what he was. He wasn't a master of the universe. He was an illusionist who had run out of smoke and mirrors. "You brought a pregnant woman into my home, David. Lisa said, her tone conversational, as if recalling a distant memory. You did it with malice, assuming I would bow to your audacity to avoid a public scandal. You thought my silence was weakness. You forgot that I was the one who drew the blueprints for your life. She reached out and picked up a sleek black pen, signing her name with a fluid, practiced motion on the top document. I am not leaving you drowning, she continued, sliding the paper toward him. I am simply turning off the pumps and letting the water find its natural level. Sign the papers, David. He stared at the signature line. If he signed, the divorce was final. He would walk out of this room officially severed from the Duchess, from the manor, from the company, and from the illusion of the man he thought he was. He would walk out with nothing but a staggering mountain of debt and a tarnished name. His hand shook as he picked up the pen. He looked at Lisa one last time, hoping to find a flicker of regret, a shadow of the woman who had quietly stood behind him for a decade. But her eyes were clear, bright, and focused entirely on the future. She had dismantled her golden cage, and in doing so, she had locked him outside in the cold. David signed his name. The scratch of the pen sounded violently loud in the quiet room. Lisa stood up, buttoning her coat. Thank you, Marcus. That will be all. She didn't look at David again. She walked out of the conference room, her heels clicking rhythmically down the hallway, a steady, powerful sound that faded away, leaving David sitting alone in the silence of his ruin. If you enjoyed this dramatic story of betrayal and calculated revenge, please consider leaving a like, sharing it with fellow fiction lovers, and subscribing for more cinematic short stories.